Let's start with prayer. Okay, join me in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for today. Thank you for all of the people that you brought here to our campus. What a joy. What a benefit it is for all of us to get to see each other and be reminded that CCE is much bigger than just our homes, much bigger than just our individual schools. And God, I pray that you would just help us to form lasting relationships and to glean from the wisdom that you've placed in someone else's mind and help to learn from other people all the time, knowing that we're all in this together and that our endeavors are ultimately to point children in your direction, to help them become more Christ-like and be poured out upon this world. So God, I ask that you would just place words into my mouth that you choose. I ask that you would send your Spirit to fill me with what needs to be said for understanding and for the benefit of the people in this room. God, we love you and we praise you. In Jesus' name, amen. So I wrote some resources up here on the board for you so that I wouldn't just be mentioning. One of the things that I do a lot of times is, what was that book? How do you spell that last name? I need to get that down. I want to buy it. So I went ahead and wrote it up here, and I'm going to explain those really quickly so that I don't forget to do that. The first one is called the Progymnasmata, Greek Textbooks of Prose, Composition, and Rhetoric. It's a compilation by George Alexander Kennedy, and I have currently misplaced my copy, so I can't show you a visual copy of that. It does have a beautiful picture of a Roman building on the front of it. But what it tells you basically is it walks you through four medieval teachers, instructors who use the progymnasmata. So you actually have original documents, well, it's a translation of course, to tell you how these men did it. And there are different ways that you can go about applying the progymnasmata. Progymnasmata, just in case you don't know, because I'm not sure what level we are in here, maybe you haven't heard of it, maybe you have, is just a series of exercises. That's why it's called pro-gym, because we exercise in the gym, right? To teach our kids how to write well and how to speak well. Okay, really it was designed to train the perfect orator, someone who would be able to stand up in a court of law and argue for or against something, someone who'd be able to stand up at a wedding and give a great toast, someone who'd be able to stand up at a funeral and move people's hearts to weeping and crying over their lost loved one. So there are many uses that we have today for rhetoric, of course, and these exercises, if you break them down and look at them from the end in mind and go backward to about the 4th grade, which is where you usually start with progym, then you can kind of see, if you break them apart, how they lead to the end goal, how they lead to a portrait of someone who can speak well, think well, and then write well. So that's what that's all about. I would highly suggest you check it out. It's not an easy read. It takes some time and it takes some thought. Because of the lofty vocabulary and just some of the things that they include, it's hugely beneficial. It's helped me in ways I can't explain, understand better how to teach progym. So I'd highly recommend it, and it's not too expensive, and you can get it on Amazon. Second, number 2, this is Erasmus of Rotterdam's Encyclopedia of Words and Ideas. If you're familiar at all with the Memoria Press classical composition written by Jim Selby, he refers to Erasmus several times throughout his curriculum, more heavily in the later stages of progym than he does in the earlier. And he mentions his methods of varying, but if you look closely, I feel like there's a lack of actually using those in his pages that he has his students do. And so I would recommend you just actually go back to the original and read the book, and then see all the different ways that you can teach your children how to vary their sentences and how to vary their thoughts in their writing. I highly recommend it, and if we have time at the end, I'll talk more about this amazing and lovely book and how you can use it. So that's another, and this one's way easier to read and understand than the first one, by the way. It's way quicker. The Book of Virtues for Young People, you probably have seen this if you've been in classical education for any amount of time, has shorter renditions of different stories from the Bible and from classics. There's a shorter part from Les Mis in here. There's a retelling of David and Jonathan's friendship in here. Just different things. And what I love about them is it's not written so low that it seems childish to my 7th and 8th graders, but it's short enough that they can read it, understand it, take it in, and then use it to write a refutation or a confirmation without me having to assign it and wait several days for them to come back after they've read it. So it really is a time saver and still very valuable. So, and these stories all are ways of instilling virtue. And so your students, if you're using these for refutations, will probably say, why do you want us to refute this story? It's teaching us good things. And your answer will always be, because you need to know what people are going to say when they're refuting your good things, the things that I'm putting in your heart and your mind. People will refute them. Are you ready to listen to what they have to say? And can you come back at them with a confirmation? So it's still, it's kind of hard for them. But wait a minute, this story's true. It's in the Bible. How can I refute it? Well, some people are going to refute it. And you need to be ready to know what they're going to say so that you can come back and combat that in a loving manner with a confirmation. So it's still really beneficial to use Tales of Virtue. And the fourth one are the classical composition books from Memoria Press that I just mentioned. There are different books for different stages of the progymnasmata. You can check those out. There are even copies of those over here because we have Memoria Press with us as a vendor. These have been super, super helpful to me. Jim Selby was actually here, I think it was 2 years ago, at the conference and talked through how to use these books. There are some things in them that I don't use any longer now that I have taught ProGym for a longer amount of time. But there are still many valuable things that I do. I pick and choose what I think works best for my students. And I'll kind of get into that a little more later. So yeah, we're going to start with the Chreia, and we're just going to dive right in. Who knows what Chreia means? I wrote it on the board. I wrote what it means on the board. It means useful. Yes, good, good. Chreia means useful. So I always like to sit down and think. I get caught up a lot of times in classical style methodologies, and I forget to look in scripture to make sure everything is fitting well in my mind. And so I think it's helpful always when you're learning something new, or even when you're just practicing it, to go back and say, what does scripture have to say about this? So Ephesians 4:29. Let come out of your mouths only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs. And so the idea here is there's this quote, and it's helpful. It's useful. Let me tell you how this quote can make your life better if you know it. It's a quote that can bring you truth, goodness, or beauty. It's a quote that can help you live a better life while you're here on this earth. And so that's why I'm going to take 8 paragraphs to tell you about this useful quote. I mean, that's basically what you're doing in a Chreia. That's the whole reason. Selby does this in 8 very long paragraphs. I don't. I teach Chreia in 6th and 7th grade, and when we do that, I want them to get an overall view of the purpose and the beauty of Chreia. And I think sometimes we can get caught up in little details that are going to come later anyway in my 8th grade class, and so I don't necessarily want to overwhelm them. I just want them to love it and be able to understand what we're doing. And so I don't do a lot of what he does in there for that reason. And here's how I do it. So you're going to see how I do it. I'll just write this up on the board. I'll tell them that we're learning about things that are useful, and then I will have them take notes in their own writing notebook. It's nothing fancy. They have to get it out and pull it out and see what notes to take. I also teach them a little way to remember it, and we're going to sing it. Are you ready? Do you like to sing? I hope you do. Okay, here's what it sounds like. The 8 steps of Chreia follow thus: encomium, paraphrase, cause, converse, analogy, example, testimony, epilogue. It's really easy. Just join me whenever you're ready. I'm going to sing it several times. Here we go. The 8 steps of Chreia follow thus: encomium, paraphrase, cause, converse, analogy, example, testimony, epilogue. The 8 steps of Chreia follow thus: encomium, paraphrase, cause, converse, analogy, example, testimony, epilogue. Yeah, see how easy that is? And the kids pick up really fast. Now, why would I do that to these kids? Well, first of all, 6th grade is still kind of in the grammar phase, and so they like that kind of stuff, right? 7th and 8th graders do too. Who are we kidding? They want to sing too. They'd rather sing than write anyway, right, for a little. But the whole overall goal and purpose of this, like I mentioned earlier, is not just writing. It's rhetoric. And so our goal at the end of this writing piece is that I have a big fishbowl up at the front of my classroom, and my students come up and pull out a quote from someone that I know that they know. That'd be kind of unfair if they didn't know the person, and you'll find out why in a minute. And they have to stand there and think, Okay, encomium, blah, 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 let me praise him, okay? Paraphrase, let me tell you what this quote means. It's all impromptu. This is teaching them impromptu speech. And if they have those 8 steps memorized in their minds, it's easy for them. And people are like, wowed, and you're like, it's really not that big of a deal, you know, if you start it the right way, and if they know all the pieces to it, and if they do it often enough, it takes practice, okay? So, what is an encomium? Anybody know the meaning of the word encomium? Yeah, to praise, okay? So, for a Chreia, you're going to praise the source, or you're going to praise the person who said, right, the quote. You're going to take a quote and you're going to praise the person who said the quote. Now there's something called a maxim that's just like a Chreia, only you don't know who said it. And if you don't know who said it, you can't praise the person who said it. So in a maxim, you just praise the quote itself. That's really the only difference between a Chreia and a maxim. That's really it. After you praise the person, okay, then you're going to paraphrase. What do you think you're going to paraphrase? Yeah, the quote. Say the meaning of the quote in your own words. Now, you guys don't need it that simply, but it helps the kids, right? So these are the kinds of things they're going to be writing down in their books, because when they get home and forget what they were supposed to do, it's really clear. It's really clear for them to know what they're supposed to be doing. Okay, the cause, okay. When you're talking about the cause, it actually means why would someone obey this quote? Why would they do what? So that makes sense, right? Why, the cause is why. And essentially the cause here is general. They're going to take a general example, okay, and it's actually a scenario that they get to make up, which they love. Imagine a village, that's what they always say. Imagine a village in where someone, you know, is not willing to give up, blah, blah, whatever the quote's about. So you're going to choose a general scenario and explain, okay, what good comes from following the quote. Now, your kids are automatically going to want to say something like, what do they always say that I say, oh, you can't say that. They say things like, if someone follows this quote, blah, 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 blah. And I don't want them to say that. I want them to say what the quote's actually trying to get them to do, right? So if your quote is about giving up safety for essential liberty, then I want them to say, you know, if a village chooses, right, to give up their own safety in order to ensure their posterity's liberty, these good things will happen. I don't want them to say, if someone follows the quote, right? You don't want them to say, you want them to actually say what the quote's wanting them to know, okay? So don't let them be lazy. Make them actually explain what the if means, okay? So that's the first general scenario. Now the converse is exactly the opposite, which makes sense. Converse, right? You're turning it around. So it's another general scenario. Imagine another village that lived across the river. However, right? Another general scenario that explains what? Bad comes from not following the quote. Okay, so the first village has decided to give up their safety and fight for their freedom, and thus securing freedom for their posterity. And the second village has decided that it would rather be safe than free and chooses not to fight, and now has given up their freedom for all prosperity. You know, this is just examples, but that's kind of the idea, right? So they're saying, you know, imagine this could be really good. This is why this is useful. Now imagine if you didn't do this, and this is bad, and that's why it would not be useful if you did the opposite of what the quote's telling you to do. So those are the paragraphs. Now, analogy is just what it sounds like. The student is identifying a similarity between the saying and something else. Okay, and we're just going to write it just like that. Identifying a similarity. Because these are terms the kids can understand, right? And that's important when they're learning how to write these. And the something else is usually something in their own lives that makes sense to them and their listeners. Okay? So, you know, maybe they can compare that to, you know, maybe they can take their quote and compare it to a soccer game. Maybe their quote is about working hard and it paying off. Or maybe they can take their quote and compare it to something that's happened on the news recently. There's always some kind of comparison they can make. And so just as people who do this end up this way, people who play soccer, and don't do this end up this way. I mean, that's just kind of a rough example, but that's what you're looking for. You're looking for an example that connects what the usefulness is of the quote to something your kid experiences every day or something that they would know about. And I try to stress with the students, it's about your audience. If you choose an analogy and your audience has no idea about soccer or no idea about whatever it is that you chose, it's not going to work. It's not going to be effective. So you have to know your audience and choose an analogy that would help them to understand the benefits of your quote better. And then example is where we get down to specifics. So analogy is more like a something that they're comparing it to. And an example usually is a someone, okay? But it's not another quote. It's someone who followed the quote and it turned out well for them, or someone who didn't follow the quote and it didn't turn out well for them. And it needs to be a someone that everyone would know or most people would know. So a specific scenario of a well-known situation involving characters that are immediately recognizable. I always think halfway through, why didn't I just make a PowerPoint? And then I remind myself, because these people are writing too. And if I'm just clicking, you don't have time to write. So if I make myself write, then you guys have time to write. But the idea here is a lot of times kids use biblical examples, and those work really, really well, especially because they know their audience is a classical Christian audience. So then I'm like, okay, you know your audience, you use David, you use Bathsheba, use whoever you want, right? That fits with this scenario. Yeah, it could be anyone in history that is well known, that they feel like their audience will have a good enough grasp on to say, look, they followed this quote now, and it turned out well for them. Or, look, they didn't, and it didn't turn out so well. So that's example. And then testimony is your last thing before your epilogue, and that is just a supporting quotation from a respected source. So it's another quote. And that's how I tell it to the kids, another quote. You're using a quote to support a quote, okay? But it has to be a respected source. Once again, someone that people are familiar with. Abraham Lincoln said so-and-so, and guess what? It's really teaching you the same thing that my quote's teaching you. So he agreed with me, or whoever. You know, they choose someone who is well respected, and it supports, so the second quote supports the first. And then the epilogue calls the audience to acknowledge the truth of the saying, right? And it can be one line long. I let the kids do one line if they want to, because most of the examples that I see given, especially in Selby, it's one line long. He calls it a paragraph, but it's just a sentence. Calls the audience, what did I say? It calls the audience to praise the truth. Yeah, acknowledge the truth of the saying. Audience, there's an N in there. So essentially, the last thought the audience is left with is, yeah, this saying is true. I should follow it. It's useful. You know, it helps me in my life. Okay, that was the most painful part, and you're still awake. Good job, good job, good job. All right, so now comes the fun part. First, though, I think before we do it on our own, I'm just going to share one with you because I think it's important to give students an example. And so I usually talk them through an example. The first day is usually this. It takes that long, right? And then the next day, we get to start visiting. Well, what does this really mean? And how do we apply it? And here's the example. So Selby gives a good example in his introduction to his Chreia and Maxim stages. And he uses the quote, "No race can prosper till it learns there is as much dignity in tilling a field as in writing a poem." And that's Booker T. Washington. So if you have any familiarity with him, you would know that he would understand that there is respect, right, and dignity in hard work. And that's the point he's trying to make, right? Poems are important and they're dignified, but also hard work is, right? Like tilling a field. So I'll just write it over here because you kind of have to have it in mind as I talk through this so that you can think about the different steps. Till it learns. Teachers can write fast, right? There is as much dignity in tilling a field as in writing a poem. So I just talk kids through. Here's what this looks like if you're taking this particular quote from Booker T. The words of Booker T. Washington are well worth our attention. Are you recognizing that this is praising the source? Yeah, this is their encomium, okay? As a man born in slavery, he should be admired for how he strove to overcome great adversity and fulfill his dreams. Those dreams were not selfish, but sought to benefit society. I will speak on his wise words in regards to the importance of labor and its relation to human dignity. Okay, so that was their encomium, okay? A long paragraph that, and I also have to tell the kids, and this is important, okay? They might know something about their famous person that has absolutely nothing to do with the quote that they spoke, right? And it might be a really cool something, right? But they don't want to use something that's not actually going to support, hey, this person knows about what he's talking about. So if the quote has to do with the dignity in tilling a field, the dignity of hard work, they might know something completely, I don't know, they might know that Booker T. Washington really loved peanut butter sandwiches. I'm just throwing that out there, which is actually before the Tuskegee Institute where they, so probably not. But anyway, yeah, so they're going to say something really great about this person, but if it doesn't have to do with the actual quote, then it's useless. And so some kids are like, but that's what I knew about him. I'm sorry, you have to find something else. And sometimes it's a really prominent, cool thing, but it's just not what you need because it's not supporting the fact that this quote is true and helpful. So all the praise has to kind of lend the audience to the idea that this person knew what they were talking about when they said that because they lived it out and it worked for them. So then you go on to paraphrase, and here's the example that Selby gives. This saying teaches that no group of people can succeed until they realize that all labor, manual or mental, brings dignity to the laborer. So basically the student is saying exactly the same thing, only in their own words. And so it's not only is it forcing them to make their audience have a more clear idea, but it forces them to have a more clear idea of what they're about to, support and write about. So that's the paraphrase. Okay, moving right along. The cause. Imagine a village. Isn't this funny? Imagine a village that knew success comes with diligence and perseverance. Even through weary toil under the sun, they understood that the worth and reward of labor existed in the value bestowed by God rather than other men. With such a truth, any people would be poised for great success. And without that truth, lasting success would not be possible. So that's the cause. These are all the great things that a village can get if they follow this, okay? And then the converse. Here's another example. The village in the next valley, across the river, right, considered that work done by the mind is easier and does not require hard work and perseverance to succeed. They sought to change how the village prospered to seek a kind of work that did not require sacrifice or pain. They began to read poetry and novels, but they were impatient and lazy. The village soon was overrun with weeds and litter. They slowly starved, experiencing only failure because success will never come to those who seek the path of least resistance and who do not cultivate the joy and energy needed for hard tasks. Lesson: plow the field while you're reading the poetry, right? No, just kidding. So that's the converse. That's the opposite, where you turn it around and say, if you don't follow the wise words of this man, you could be in this same kind of dire situation. So here's their analogy, which is helpful because kids can always relate to professional athletes, I feel like, even, CCE kids. So here's the example that Selby gives us. Just as professional athletes know that their success depends upon their willingness to work hard when they are not in the spotlight, so no group of people can prosper until it learns there is as much dignity in the unglamorous work of tilling a field as in writing a poem. And so is this repetitive? Yes. Is that okay? Yes, because it's rhetorical. They're not saying the exact same thing over and over. They're putting a different turn on it, a different spin on it every time. But it's subconsciously seeping into the audience's minds as truth. Oh, we should follow this. Oh, this sounds good. Oh, yeah, that's true. So that's kind of the goal. The example. Consider the Egyptians. Okay, well, example is supposed to be a specific situation involving well-known characters that are immediately recognizable. Is that good? Does that work? Yes. Who refused to allow the Hebrews to depart their land. The Egyptians considered the work done by the Hebrews as below Egyptian dignity. The Egyptians saw no virtue in making bricks for construction, and as a result, the country experienced the judgment and punishment of God and slipped into inevitable decline. So there's your example. Pretty good one. Testimony. Solomon confirmed this saying. Now, your testimony doesn't always have to be a biblical figure. It can be someone else, but it can be a biblical figure. It just needs to be a quote. Solomon confirmed this saying when he wisely stated, "Where no oxen are, the crib is clean, but much increase is by the strength of the ox." In other words, prosperity often depends upon doing the dirty work, like tilling a field, in contrast to the clean work, like writing poetry. Did they repeat themselves again? Yes, but was it different? Yes, it was. And so the kids oftentimes will be like, I feel like I'm saying the same thing over and over again. And I look at them and say, you are. But you have to do it in a way that convinces your audience, because your audience needs to hear something at least 7 times before they even start to believe you, right? Okay, and then the epilogue, really basic and simple. Considering these thoughts of Booker T. Washington on the dignity of labor, we may rightly applaud his wisdom. So they're going back to, praising the person, but also recognizing the truth of the quote. Okay, we are a group of educated people, and I am sure that in here we can come up with a really great quote that we can write a Chreia on, and I can't wait to hear it. I'm all ears. What do you think? What should we use? It'll be fun. Hey, I did this in 6th grade with Mr. Lindine's class. A kid raises his hand and he says, "Everybody needs a little friend, Bob Ross." I'm telling you, it turned out to be one of the most philosophical Chreias we've ever written. It turned into community versus, being solitary. It turned into hermits versus living in cities. So, it actually turned out really great. I was kind of giggling. The class was kind of, I'm like, let's go with it. Let's see where we end up. So you never know. Give me a quote. Let's see where we can end up. I'm going to wait till you give me a quote. I'm also going to see if there are some tissues in here. Yes. Can you hand me a tissue? Thank you, dear.
Then after she spoke with my class, I had them each go home and come up with their best quote. They wrote them on the boards. We had 20 quotes on the board. I could get that picture out if I need to.
Super fun.
The one that the class voted on was better to fight for something than live for nothing.
That's a good one.
George Patton.
That's a good one. You want to do that one? You got a better one? You're thinking.
He gives twice, who gives too quickly.
He gives twice, who gives too quickly. Who said that?
I think, I don't know, maybe Horace or...
We could write a maxim on it. If we don't know who said it, we can still do it. We just can't praise the writer. We have to just praise the saying. We could still do it. We could still walk through it. You're going to have to tell it to me again.
He gives twice, he who gives too quickly.
Okay, you're going to have to explain it to me.
Well, before you give something, make sure that that's what you want to do. Otherwise, you may pay the price twice. It may cost you twice.
Like, so you don't think about it and you give something away,
Right.
then you're going to end up having to give it again, thinking that you needed it or something, thinking that you shouldn't have given it away.
Yeah. But,
Yeah, it is a proverb.
That's what I was going to do.
Proverb. But that would work. I mean, you could write it up as a maxim. All right, what do we want to do? I'll put this one up here. He gives twice, who gives too quickly.
I like yours better. I think we should go.
What was yours? That's okay. What was yours? I don't remember now.
Better to fight for something than live for nothing.
You know what I've always wanted to write a Chreia on, and I never have, is Mother Teresa's, "We do what we know, and when we know better, we do better." Yeah. Wouldn't that be a good one? I never have done it, but it's a good idea. Like, put that in the back of your mind and try to write one sometime, and then tell me how it worked out. Then live for nothing.
For nothing.
Sorry, I'm talking and I should be writing. It's a story of my life. Okay, so you want to go with this one?
Sure.
Okay, all right, we'll try this one. Better to fight for something than to live for nothing. And did you have, is it General Patton, you think?
It is.
Okay, great. Okay, now, obviously, we need to know a little bit of something about General Patton. Do we? What do we know about General Patton? If we don't know,
He was fighting. He's a general.
okay, he's tough.
You got lots
Okay.
of ones in here.
So, okay, but this is good because this is what happens in your classroom, right? You go, oh, this is great. Oh, no, wait a minute. And so then what has to happen? You have to plan for, okay, guys, you're going to have to find out something about General
They went home
Patton.
and they did some research
Yeah.
and came back with really good information.
Yeah. Do you remember any of it?
Yes.
Tell me.
He was a general, he was a leader in World War I, but I can't remember if he was a general yet. But he was a general in World War II.
Yeah.
A
General in World War II.
Was he in the Pacific?
In Europe.
Oh, Europe?
Yeah.
He earned the, what's the top medal you can get in the military? Should run back and get the papers.
It's okay. We'll just do the best we can with what we have in our brains about him. I'm not a history teacher of that time period, so I don't really know that much about it. I mean, I know him,
He
but
was very kind of rough. He demanded a lot, which would make sense.
Purple Heart.
oh, we're gonna put that in here. Is it Purple Heart?
It says he got the Purple Heart, the Legion of Merit, the Bronze Star, the Silver Star, the Distinguished
Bronze Star, I
Service
think, is what.
It was well decorated. Yeah.
I don't know. Demanded a high what? Help me. See, here's what we do. We just look at it and go, what do we say? A confident leader of troops during World War
Yeah, he
II.
demanded
General Patton demanded excellence from his.
commitment.
Okay, so we get the idea, right?
Yeah.
We're filling this in of ways that we praise him. And does that make sense? Are we praising him for the right things if we look at the quote? Better to fight for something than to live for nothing. So we can praise his position as a general. We can praise the fact that he was tough. We can praise the fact that he was successful and all of the medals that he's won. And will those things then point back to, yeah, this guy knew what he was talking about when he said this. That's what we want, right? So that's what we want. Okay, great. And then the next thing, somebody paraphrase this for us. Now, I'm not looking for a 5-line long paragraph like I gave you the example for. I think it's important to just say, can you put this in your own words and write it up there and move on to the next thing, especially when you're first teaching it, because you want your kids to go, I get it. I know why we're doing this. I know the steps. Then you can always elaborate. You can always help them go back and fill in other ways to say what they've said again. So paraphrase, what do you think?
Do you ever have them use Erasmus's methods or variation for this?
I do, all the time, I do. And so we'll look at it. That's kind of a whole nother lesson that I would love to get into. But what I will do is I will throw up an example. I don't know if you know of his Your Letter Pleased Me Greatly example in Erasmus. And then I will have them rewrite it however many times. And so as a class then, you can throw this up on the board and do that very same activity. How do you rewrite this? And how many different things can we get that say exactly the same thing? And then they stand up and share them, and it's huge. It's really good for them. And then you can actually break that down and go, what did you use? Because what he has in here in this book is outlined different methods, okay, and different strategies and different vocabulary terms that I've given you on that handout in the back of what you can use. Let me just give you an example since you brought it up because it's good stuff. The first method is by synonymia. That's the method that is done to death because kids know what synonyms are, right? I'm so sorry. Thank you. And so they know, well, you take one word and you replace it with another word that means almost the same thing, and you've got to paraphrase, right? And that's actually probably the most simplistic form of paraphrasing. It works. There's nothing wrong with it. But there are other ways that they can do that. So he has things like enalage, okay? The next method of varying is when something of variety is gained by a small change in the same word, okay? Taking a word like voracious and replacing it with I devour. voracious, devour. And teaching them that there's actually a difference between that and a synonym, right? That you're actually using the same base word and you're just giving a different form of it, and that's how enillage differs from synonymia. And so when you take your letter pleased me greatly, you have kids that end up with I gained pleasure from your letter, and then they have to then tell you, oh, that's enillage, it's not synonymia. And so there are some technical terms that you have to be able to navigate, but those terms actually are helpful because it gives students more tools in their toolbox to use. So yeah, I do, to answer that question. That was a long answer to a short question, but yes, I do use that for these kinds of activities. So I'm still waiting. Paraphrase. It's the mark of a good teacher to be very comfortable in silence. Better to fight for something than to live for nothing.
While they're thinking, I don't know if this is a good strategy or not, but for that first paragraph, I put them into small groups so they could kind of discuss together, and they wrote the first paragraph together.
That's good. Yeah.
And then the rest they did on their own. But.
Yeah. No, I think that's really good. I think any time that they can glean from each other's thinking is a good thing. Two heads are better than one.
So sometimes if someone just throws out something, then
that's right. Then they can start building from
the
it.
conversation. Yeah.
So that's what you guys should do. Just throw something out. That's what he's trying to tell you.
It is good to, I'm trying to think of a synonym for fight, like strive for.
Yeah. If you put it in the context of the person who said it, you almost say better to die for, or being willing to die for, or being willing to be hurt or put in danger. I mean, nothing sounds perfect the first time you say it. That's why you have to throw things out there and then fix them. And that's huge for your kids. And if you have a class like my 7th graders this year, they're not going to do it for a while. They just sit there and look at you like, I don't want to be wrong. Because they're grammar school students and they've been at CCE since they were in 2nd grade, and they're smart and they just knew the answers. They knew how to just because they memorized and did all their homework and did everything they're supposed to. And when they end up in my dialectic classroom and I say, just throw it out there and say, they go, it takes a long time to get them comfortable with that. And that's a whole other ballgame. But it seems as though you might be struggling with the same thing. I just realized.
While they're struggling, I thought maybe I'd run back to my room and get one. I don't know.
That'd be great. Anything you've got that they can see, I think is helpful.
We're trying to paraphrase this saying?
Yeah.
These are them? Okay.
Yeah. Better to fight for something than live for nothing. How do we say that again in our own words and make it mean around the same thing? I'm not meaning to not look at you ladies. I'm really sorry that I keep turning this way. Looking at you.
You introduce it by saying, he said that? No.
You can. We're not on that step. Like you do have to say the quote before you actually start the Chreia. You have to say something like, General Patton once said, it is better to fight for something than live for nothing. And then you go into the encomium, praising him. And now we're on this part, the paraphrase. So essentially what we're doing is we're trying to put the meaning of this quote into the minds of our listeners so that they understand it better, right? And that's harder to do than you would think, obviously, right? Because we're struggling with it. So if you say something like,
a meaningful life is better than...
There you go.
Right, something like...
Yes.
That, or,
Watching TV all day.
So, yeah, a meaningful life is of more value or is worth fighting for, maybe. That's a little different than what he's saying, but it's close. What else?
Rather than having no purpose whatsoever.
Yeah.
We can improve on that, but maybe.
So maybe it's having a life's purpose or having purpose. Well, how do we say that? How do we say the opposite?
I said there's a purpose worth dying for. There's a cause worth dying for.
Yeah. Okay.
Something would be like a cause.
Great.
I like that.
A life lived for a cause worth dying for, that's 2 4s, so it's a lot of wordy stuff, is better than, I don't know. Maybe the whole idea is that he's putting himself in danger, right? So maybe,
Well, I
better
think
to
the
fight for
whole
something than
idea
live for
is
nothing.
that you're willing to give up
Yeah,
everything for something.
that's right. So a worthy cause is worth
Risky.
a risk, is worth the risk.
Yeah.
A word that maybe, and maybe we just say that,
Yeah.
right?
There you go.
A worthy cause. See, now we got to it. Now it took some time, but we got there, and that's good. And it's going to take your kids time, and so you have to be able to wait on them, right, and help them out.
Say a word twice though, because you're saying a word.
Oh, you're right. Ooh, so now what do we say?
Did you do living boldly?
I like that.
No, because living boldly.
Yeah, but I don't know if living boldly means you have something to fight for. I mean, maybe you do.
But you could be bold about things not worth.
You could, but does he actually talk about the worth of fighting? He just says better to fight for something than live for nothing. Oh,
We have to refute it. And
you're
I'm not
right.
gonna refute.
Oh, you're thinking ahead. The kids do that too. They're like, I don't want to say this because then I have to write the confirmation. I'm like, yeah. Holds more value. No. Okay, but something about it's valuable, right? We have to talk about this cause is valuable enough to sacrifice for it. A worthy cause deserves sacrifice.
An honorable cause.
Or cause. Ooh, that's better. And I love it. An honorable cause
Now we can say it's
Deserves
worth.
sacrifice. That's good.
deserves.
Oh.
And I don't know if we're saying exactly the same thing here, but it is kind of a paraphrase, you know what I'm saying? An honorable cause deserves sacrifice. Maybe we could say, and its value, I don't know, like I want to make a comparison there because that's what he's doing, right? Better to fight for something than to live for nothing. And its value supersedes a meaningless life. I mean, that's really wordy, and your kids probably wouldn't come up with that. But it's just like ideas, right? So yeah, you work through it, okay? You don't get anything perfect the first time. That's what writing's all about, right? But it's somewhere to start. So there's your paraphrase. Of course, ideally, you know, after you've worked through it and you have tweaked it a little bit and you've made it the way you want it, you're going to end up with 3 sentences. I tell the kids you need 3 sentences. And so and that's where okay, we're writing the same thing again. Yes, you are, but how do you word it differently so that you're approaching it in a different way and people are listening to you? Good. So
The paraphrase is 3 sentences?
yeah, I
Okay.
usually do 3 sentences on everything except the epilogue, and I let them do that in 1. Selby goes into way more detail and requires a lot more sentences. I don't. I feel like this gets them where they need to be at this stage in their writing. So that's just up to you, how far you want to go with it.
Do more at an upper level?
At the 8th grade level, it looks different because they're doing encomiums and invectives, and there are more things for them to fit in there. It's not so cut and dried as here's one step, here's one step, here's one step. Now they say, here's one phase, but you're going to have to cover 3 different things in that phase in these paragraphs. So it does look very different. You're requiring them to do more at the 8th grade level, for sure. But yeah, definitely 6th grade, I think, because I want them to know, okay, this is supposed to be a paragraph, so how do I do this, and how do I have some detailed sentences, and how do I prove what I've just said, and this is my main idea. You're weaving those kinds of things in there. All right, we're totally losing time fast, and I'm probably not going to get to refutation, but this is good, right? I mean, we're making ourselves work through it. So cause, a general scenario that explains what good comes from following the quote. So, imagine a village. Okay, maybe you say something like, a community that is willing to stand up for what they deem, worthy or honorable or true or good. And then what? They have to fill in the end. How is that good for them? Does that make sense? Yeah, and so then you switch it for your converse and you say, but across the river, right? That other village, but a community who is not willing to fight for honorable things essentially leads a life of meaninglessness, and whatever you say, a meaningless life. So there's your converse, and then you're asking them, once they get that one main idea, that main sentence, topic sentence, then they need to expound. Okay, what does this sound like? What does it look like? Much like he did with Booker T. I'm running through a little quicker because we're running out of time, but analogy. So what could be an analogy? Better to fight for something than live for nothing.
Women's rights.
Okay. I think that's something that people would be able to go, okay, you know, people stood up to fight for something that they believed was right, and so therefore their lives had purpose, and they're remembered in history for this particular reason. Okay? You could do that with lots of things, not just women's rights. You know, there are a lot of times in history where people stood up and fought for something, you know, French Revolution, you know, whatever. If you didn't want historical though, because what happens is you find this kind of blurred line between analogy and example. So if you go to a historical example, then you go, well, I kind of already did that. And so I mean, that makes sense. It is an analogy. But remember how I said sometimes it's easy to think of the analogy as a what and the example as a who? That might help you remember that a what could be a kid who chooses to go out and help somebody raise money by selling cookies instead of sitting on the couch and watching his video games. You know, so this is meaningless, whereas that shows worth and meaning in a life. So you kind of have to place yourself into the mind of a 6th grader and say, what can you compare this to? Especially if your 6th grader is going to read this to a 6th grade audience, right? So you're going to want to say, okay, what's the what that you can do that he says you should do? And how would you do it in your life? You know, kind of like the soccer example. So, you know, if you have an example like that, an analogy like that, then when you move on to example, you can mention women's rights, or you can mention something from the Bible. You know, oh, we fought for it, then, you know, instead of cowering back and not doing what God had us to do. Those kinds of things. Good, good. And then testimony is another quote. And a lot of times I just let kids go and research. Can you find a quote that means kind of the same thing? That if something in life is important, then you should be willing to fight for it. And if you're not, then it's really not important. Or if you don't have anything that you are passionate enough in life to fight for, do you have a lot of meaning in your life? Do you feel passionate about those kinds of things? And so then they're going to, you know, look for another quote. And I've not ever had a kid, I mean, I've only been teaching this for 4 years, so 4 years, but I've not had a kid that has come up and said, I just can't find another quote that means that. There's always another quote out there that's kind of the basic general. I mean, there are only so many great ideas, right? Mm-hmm. And so if you're pulling quotes that teach the great ideas, like fighting for what you believe in, you're going to find quotes all over the place. So good. And then the epilogue is just one last sentence that calls the audience to acknowledge the truth. Usually it repraises the person, you know, obviously General Patton in all of his glory and honor and sacrifice, you know, chose to bring us words of wisdom. It can be that easy. It can be that quick. I'm just leaving your audience with that. All right, any questions about Chreia? Because we have like 8 minutes left for Refutation and we're never going to get done. But I can still kind of talk through it a little bit with you. Are we good on Chreia? I should have known, because last year I was thinking, okay, I'll do fable and narrative and Chreia. No. We got through fable and part of narrative. So this year, why didn't I just say Chreia? Like, I should know this by now. That's okay. So Refutation, the verse that I use, if you want to jot down 2 Corinthians 10, 5-7, just to know that there's a biblical basis of this idea that we are supposed to refute things, right? And what kinds of things are we supposed to refute as Christians? Inasmuch as we refute arguments and theories and reasonings and every proud and lofty thing that sets itself up against the true knowledge of God. And we lead every thought and purpose away captive into the obedience of Christ. I love that. That's so beautiful. If our kids can refute what is against the truth, then they can lead every thought and purpose away captive into the obedience of Christ. So that's a very moving verse for me. I'm just going to speak through these, and then I'm going to offer my email. And if you would like a full thing of notes, I will just send it to you. I also I haven't explained much about this handout, and I didn't want to leave you wondering what this is. This is actually a project that I did for one of my master's classes, because I got my master's in CCE at New St. Andrews. And so it was this idea of how do we teach the progym in grades 4 through 8 in a way that they can handle on their level and that they enjoy. That was kind of the whole project. And so this is just an example of the curriculum that I came up with. It has all of the sources here, resources, the materials needed. And then it goes through week by week of a 7th grade year of what I do with the kids. And so this may help you and it may not help you. I just throw that in there. I also want to offer you, if you want, I can give you 4th and 5th and 6th and 8th. This is just an example of 7th. But I did that for 4th through 8th grades. And essentially what I did, Selby's books are so helpful. And they give a really good, clear picture of what is a fable, and then they practice it over and over and over again their 4th grade year. And what is a narrative, and they go over and over again 5th grade year. So what I did was start in 4th with basically the fable, although I also had threw narrative in there a couple of times, because I think 4th graders can do narratives just as easily as 5th graders. And then in 5th grade, they start with fable and do a lot of narrative. And in 6th grade, they do fable and narrative and Chreia. So it's cycling. And they're not just getting it one time for a whole year, because the difference in a Chreia written by an 8th grader and a Chreia written by a 7th grader is huge. And why wouldn't you want them to be able to use what they learn in those 2 years to do better, right? And to see that it's different than what they thought at the beginning. And the difference in a narrative or a fable, my 8th graders love to write fables. And so we do them all. And so in 7th grade, we'll start and we'll do fable and narrative and Chreia and, work our way up until the end is common topic. And then in 8th grade, they'll do all of them again, okay? But it's quick, because they already know, right? So it's 1 week and we're through one. Here's our fable week. We're going to read them and enjoy them, and we're going to write from this perspective and from that perspective, and these guys are going to be the ants, and these guys are going to be the grasshoppers, and whatever, so it's like 1 week, and so it's just a review. But it's good because then they don't lose it, because by the time I send them across the way over here to Amy, I want them to remember those things, to use them well, and to know how they fit in the upper levels of the progym. With that all said, I'm just going to speak through this really quickly. Refutation, it starts with a discredit, and you start with just a really broad, vague overview of dissing, completely dissing, which the kids love because they're dialectic students. They're all ready to diss the author, right? All authors of that genre. So, it begins, and Selby gives you examples of it, of, writers of fictional tales, and they don't say things like should be drug out in the street and shot, but they can say things like, claim that, let me think. Writers of fictional tales get fact and morals confused, or whatever. It's just this basic, vague statement that is negative about all authors like this author that they're getting ready to talk about. And then the second line in the discredit part is then they get to hone in on the actual story they're trying to refute, to discredit. And so they'll mention the title of the story, and they'll say something really vague about it that's putting it down again, right? And it is a balancing act with 7th and 8th grade, because they want to get mean and nasty. And you have to go, no. This is a respectable thing that we're doing. We are trying to actually convince someone that this piece of work is not worth their time because it doesn't teach them truth, goodness, and beauty. And so if you're refuting it in a way that is not using truth, goodness, and beauty, then you're completely and totally contradicting yourself. And it takes a little bit for that. And then they have your thesis statement, where they make a statement about what's wrong with the story itself. They get down to say, this it wastes readers' time, or this is immoral, or whatever they want to say. There are other steps, and I don't want to keep you. I know it's Friday and it's late. The exposition is a retelling of the story. This is why they learned how to write a narrative, because that's what this is. So they go through and they retell the story. That's the exposition. They already know how to do that because we've done it earlier, right? So it's easy for them. Unclarity means they're going to pick one thing and prove how it's unclear, because the effect could not come from that cause. It could be anything in the story they want. Implausibility, they're going to pick one thing and say how it was unlikely to happen, and here's why. Impossibility, they're going to pick one thing and say it's absolutely impossible, this could not have happened, and here's why. Inconsistency shows a character's actions, and it can be either that they did something inconsistent in the story, or that they did something that's inconsistent with who they are. Like, this father did this, that's not what fathers do. This mother did this, that's not what mothers do, that kind of a thing. Impropriety is anything immoral. Why would George Washington's father give him an axe at 6 years old? That is immoral, and then just go on, with why, proving that point. Inexpediency, basically anything in the story that wasn't helpful. Why does the reader care that the axe was shiny? The problem is the axe was sharp. That's inexpedient. Why would the author take the time to even tell us that it was sharp? Things like that. So it's training them to recognize how they can argue against things. That's what's happening, okay? In sometimes a silly manner, but it's interesting to them, and so it gets them on the right track. That's what they want to do. And the epilogue here is very similar to the epilogue here in that it is one line. May all the poets who tell ridiculous stories find other things to do, or other ways to use their time, or whatever. So it's just one sentence. I wish we had more time. I would love to talk to you more about confirmations. They're super fun. I hope you can get some good things out of these sources. And I am going to write my email up here for you. Maybe next year I'll just start at Refutation and say, that's all I'm doing. And maybe we'll actually get through it. Please do not hesitate to shoot me an email and tell me what all you would like. I can send you that whole packet of 4th through 8th. I can give you all of these notes and example lessons if you are interested. I'm happy to share anything I have. Thank you for staying so late on a Friday.